I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone. I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value.
Welcome to Unstacking the Deck. I'm Jason Robo.
And I'm Kyle Beatty.
And this is our episode on the media monopoly. Today's guest is Joe Shermis from the local Steelhead Special.
Yeah, we interviewed Joe Shermis discussing his experience putting out an alternative newspaper. Some of you might have seen it around town. This entire episode will be discussing the media monopoly, as Jason said, how the corporations and government entities and think tanks in charge of these news organizations, if you want to call them that, have been able to take over basically all of our channels of information and have been able to essentially mind control much of the population into going along with wars and banker bailouts and various other lies that are detrimental to all of us.
Yeah, and these tactics have been finely honed over a large extent of human history and have ultimately been finely tuned through people like Edward Bernays, who will feature in a future episode on mind control, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud and used his psychoanalytic teachings and insights in order to finally pick the human brain to get them to do what these marketers want to do, and he's the godfather of marketing. But today we're generally going to talk about the media construct itself, how it's consolidated and controlled by a handful of people, and that most media outlets, some people would think, are independent, such as Democracy Now! And NPR, are actually controlled by the military-industrial complex and nonprofit, tax-exempt wealth shelters by the elites that carry out an agenda that is ultimately to have a one-world government and a collectivist state where everybody is all under the yoke of an international government structure.
This episode's word of the week is monopoly.
Monopoly, as defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is an exclusive privilege to carry out business, traffic, or service granted by government.
Yeah, we really see this avenue of monopoly in our own system with the FCC, which grants licenses and permits to radio stations, news networks, TV networks that are allowed to broadcast, as well as telecom companies. And they're the ones that are given the exclusive rights to be able to go on air and do what they want and say what they want to say. And that's where you really see the instance of this monopoly being used, especially the collusion of government and corporations, where these corporations usually are paying off and giving bribes to the government officials in order to get their group passed through, basically.
And it's also important to note that the airwaves for our radio and television shows are actually owned exclusively by the people, and that they have effectively been hijacked by these institutions, which have said that they're guarding and preserving and maintaining a consistent form of broadcasting and that kind of thing. In reality, it was an effort to have under their control a cartel, which would strictly prohibit anything that would go against the objectives of people in higher up places.
Yeah, they claim it's a free market, but when you have, and that there's no monopolies and we have antitrust laws and everything, but when you have a situation where select groups of corporations, where many of them have board members who are on other boards of other corporations that interlock and go between each other, it really becomes a monopoly scenario where they're not allowing the voice of others. And that's why public access is such a good opportunity, because they are allowing people like us to go out and speak on television, and for all of you to have a chance to hear what we have to say.
Well, that's why our word of the day was monopoly, because that's in reality and effect what is happening. Maybe it's a low-numbered oligopoly with a handful of people, but generally it's all under certain interests, which are effectively in our country the Council on Foreign Relations, and as a larger scale, on the larger scale is the Bilderberg Group and these other elite bodies.
Our first story comes from Willits News by Linda Williams, titled "Renewing Local Beef and Lamb Industry Production Could Become a Reality." And this article discusses how they basically have a plan to put in a new meat processing facility, probably in Mendocino County is what it's looking like. And this should be able to help local ranchers be able to get their products out to the slaughterhouse in order to get the meat that's necessary, so that it doesn't have to be being sold to all these big corporations that run these giant slaughterhouses with disease-ridden meat that are going through there, and stuff can't be done the proper way that it should be. Whereas at these meat facilities, the animal's processed all in the same amount of time. It's not waited over for hours like at these giant slaughterhouses in the rest of the country. So this should really help a lot of people in the local economy, a lot of local ranchers be able to get their livestock out to product a lot easier, especially the organic niche markets for meats.
Speaking of livestock, the second story we have for you locally is from the Ukiah Daily Journal. It's entitled "H1N1 Free Clinic Scheduled, Open to Everyone." Mendocino Community Health Services was giving free H1N1 vaccination, stating that the California Department of Public Health recommends children 6 months of age and older up to 10 years have to get vaccinated twice within a 28-day period, which is disturbing since we've shown on the show previously that the vaccinations are a toxic subsidy for the pharmaceutical industry, and modern-day eugenics, which has been widely rejected by the population. People aren't taking these across the globe.
Out of the Times-Standard, from Chris Durant, the FBI has had an open house in Fortuna. They have opened a new office there. Basically, they said that they have grown out of their Eureka office and needed to expand to a bigger one. And they plan to continue to be working with local law enforcement to track down criminal organizations that are trafficking illicit substances, mostly methamphetamine, I assume they're talking about, because that's a real big issue in the county, and something that should definitely be getting a hold of.
Our next story from the Times-Standard is actually based on an opinion piece by Dave Stancliffe entitled "Suffer the Children, the Lethal Legacy of Agent Orange" in the Times-Standard. It's about Sharon Perry, a widow of a Vietnam War veteran. It chronicles her children and her husband's experience after being exposed to Agent Orange during his time in Vietnam. Reuben C. Perry III, her husband, suffered a multitude of disabilities, and also the children that they had as a result of his exposure to Agent Orange. Veterans actually had the burden of proof that they were in exposed areas, quote unquote, to the military, but until July 18th, 2008, the Agent Orange Equity Act was passed, which lifted the burden of proof from the veterans and their families. But still today, there really hasn't been much study on children and the offspring of these veterans and whatnot. And Agent Orange, which was used to destroy vegetation, has actually had a substantial effect on these people's lives. And Perry, the surviving widow, and her daughter have actually started an Agent Orange awareness page called the Agent Orange Legacy, and the website is agentorangelegacy.ning.com.
Our next article comes from the Humboldt Beacon, written by Kathy Miller. One Man's Mission, Eel River Cleanup. It's about a man, John Casilli, who is a local man here, who's helped start the Eel River cleanup crew. And they basically have gone around different areas of the Eel River, which have been being used essentially as kind of homeless campsites and stuff. And they've gone around to these areas and helped clean up the rivers, clean up a lot of the trash that's been around the area. One thing that he says is that he has contacted several different government agencies to try and get help in cleaning up all these areas, and basically no one's responded, no one wants to have a piece of it. So good job, John Casilli, and the rest of your crew for going out there and doing that, which the government refuses to get involved in.
And another story related to that from the Times-Standard, more groups join Klamath Agreement, is about the Karuk tribe and the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations have joined the ranks of those formally supporting the Klamath River dam removal agreements. These agreements would have the dams removed by 2020, provided a U.S. Department of the Interior review by 2012 finds the project to be in the public interest.
Out of the Fort Bragg Advocate News, claims prompt investigation of police chief, written by Tony Reed. And yeah, there were claims submitted there to the city that the police chief had been using essentially city materials, the police cars and cell phones, for non-city work, doing his own personal activities and stuff. This investigation did go through, and the city did conclude that as a result of the investigation, findings been sustained that Chief Puthuff has been used city equipment and city time for non-city purposes. Basically, they said that they're going to look into it further, depending on how severe the charges were, how severe the actions were. They'll be taking internal disciplinary action. Nothing's been released as far as criminal charges or anything.
In other news from the Times-Standard, Tyson cleared of liability and harassment suit by Thaddeus Greenson. The story goes on to explain that the Eureka City manager David Tyson has been cleared of liability in a $1.4 million civil suit alleging that Tyson acted inappropriately towards Tawny Hansen, a former EPD employee, and vindictively and unreasonably delayed an investigation of a fellow employee's blog, which was accusing that Hansen had an affair with EPD chief. Eureka Police Department Chief Gar Nielsen. Hansen won a $10,000 settlement against regarding the allegations. The judge, John Feeney, has ruled that Tyson was acting within the scope of his duties, but the city can be liable for the suit, which will move forward. Depositions have been taking place with city officials, which were stopped when a Times-Standard reporter refused to leave the proceedings. Larry Glass, a Eureka council member, has reported rumors of taking out Nielsen and is dissatisfied with the city's investigation.
Thaddeus Greenson also wrote an article in the Times-Standard discussing how all the stimulus money was spent, which we also covered on our last show here about the federal stimulus money. And one thing that I thought was real important that they discussed in this article is they say, though this type of funding shell game, using stimulus funds to backfill state cuts, has undoubtedly helped local schools, it's not the most effective way to stimulate the economy. And this is really a key point here, because they're basically having all these cuts going throughout the states because there's no money, and so the federal government prints a whole bunch of money up out of nowhere and gives it to them. And that's not a good way to solve your problem. It might solve things in the short run, but really it's going to compound the problem later, and is going to make all of our inflation a lot worse in the end.
Next story, also from the Times-Standard, is by James Falk, and it's entitled "Supervisors Race Attracting Big Money Already." Humboldt candidates for the Board of Supervisors have been getting lots of money. The article consults HSU professor and poli-sci Jadon Emmenheiser, who says that Humboldt is catching up with other costly elections around the state, and politicians spend more time catering to donors than studying issues. Since Measure T in Humboldt County, which barred outside corporate donations from our elections, was overturned, and the recent unlimited corporation campaign contributions from another court ruling, it is bound to get worse. Emmenheiser suggests switching to a publicly funded campaign model where voters decide how much money to allocate to campaigns, and candidates are forced to live within those bounds. That might mean a very short campaign season, Emmenheiser said, but it would also mean a more level playing field. The idea hasn't gained much traction, and he goes on to say that nobody is willing to take it seriously to have a publicly funded campaign model.
Also from the Times-Standard, the College of the Redwoods has been removed from accreditation warning status, which they have been on, and has been basically blocking a lot of programs that they've been trying to initiate. Quote, "This will open up the doors for 12 new programs to be approved that CR received funds for but couldn't move forward with until the warning status was lifted."
In other related local college news, Humboldt State University employee info possibly compromised after computer virus, also coming from the Times-Standard by Chris Durant. A Humboldt State University computer was infected with a virus which may have exposed the personal information of 3,500 people employed by the school between 2002 and 2006.